All right. Good morning officially. Welcome to Thursday, the day before Friday. I think I asked this in my class this morning, but what are you guys doing this weekend? Big plans? You just sleep all the way through?
Probably.
Just like set your alarm for Monday morning and just
I wish.
go right through? Yeah. I'm gonna do the same thing. I was saying this morning that all during holidays I was getting up at like 9:30 in the morning, and so now I'm back to like 6:15, and so that's been a hard adjustment. So I think I need to catch up a little bit on sleep. I'm gonna change the thermostat in the house. It's gonna be fun as long as it works.
Yeah.
If it doesn't work, it's going to be cold and frustrating. But anyway. Okay, so Anna's here. Good morning, Anna. Alicia's here. Good morning to you, Alicia. And Peter's here. Morning, Peter. All right. So, yes. So, yesterday we were talking about I guess we were talking about the beginnings of this class, right, in terms of what history is. We talked a little bit about the idea that history is not just a pile of facts and dates and people, because that doesn't mean anything, right? Historians and sometimes politicians, they will take those facts and put them into a narrative. They'll put them into a story, right? And again, we said that whether we're dealing with primary sources which come to us from the time, or whether we're dealing with secondary sources that are assembled from primary sources, or even, if you want to get really fancy, tertiary sources, right, which are assembled from secondary sources, which this textbook is, all of them are not entirely 100% objective, right? We said primary sources can tell us some information, but people in the past, they don't know everything about everything, right? So just because they were there at the time doesn't mean they knew everything that was to be known, right? And I made that example of me writing a book about Justin Trudeau. I don't know anything about Justin Trudeau. I've read about him in the newspaper. That's about it, right? So I don't have any special knowledge that other people don't have. The other thing we said is that every source is created for an audience, right? And so we said primary sources, for instance, might be your diary, right? And the audience might just be you, hopefully, as long as nobody finds your diary. Unfortunately for our former Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, they did find his diaries and then wrote a book about it. So now everybody knows. Your audience could be the entire country, right? It could be your school. It could be your teacher, right? It could be me if you write an assignment. If you have a source like this, a tertiary source, who's the audience for this? Who? Yeah, but who are the readers? Students, yeah, right? This is for an audience of students. And interestingly, the audience here is Western Canadian students, because if you read through this book, you'll see a lot of references to things about Canada, right, in world history, but also things about Western Canada, right? And again, if you look at the beginning of the book here, you'll see that, where is it? The people who reviewed this textbook, they're all from Western Canada. Most of them are from Alberta. One guy from Port Coquitlam. So this is a source that's designed for students. It's designed for Canadian students, but it's even further designed for Western Canadian students, right? And that's gonna influence what goes in there, right? If they can mention something about Western Canada, yeah, they're probably going to. So every source we deal with has an audience, and that audience kind of dictates what gets said, right, and what doesn't get said. So primary, secondary sources. And then we started talking about World War I, right? And we said that prior to World War I, it's kind of a different world we're living in, right? It's a world with really, I'm not even sure that it's a world that we would recognize anymore, right? It's a much more basic world. Technology plays such a huge role in all of our lives, but technology wasn't, nearly as advanced then as it is now, right? Most people, people didn't have electricity, right? People didn't have radios, they didn't have telephones, they didn't have cars for the most part. If you wanted to get around, you walked or you took a horse cart, right? Maybe you sailed across the ocean if you had the money to do it, but people didn't go on vacation. They didn't really even vacation actually wasn't even a thing at this point, right? People didn't really have leisure time like we do now, right? So it was really socially, culturally, politically, economically, technologically, an entirely different world, right? One that we might not recognize. Yesterday we talked about some of the causes of World War I, right? There was some underlying causes, and then there was kind of a spark, if you will, that lit the whole thing up. But what were some of those underlying causes? Ryan, can you give me just one of those underlying causes?
The death of Ferdinand.
Yeah, Franz Ferdinand's death. Not an underlying cause, but the spark, right? That's the spark that lights the whole thing up. What are some Regina, can I get an underlying cause from you? Yeah, there was an alliance system, right? And do you remember why countries started forming alliances? To avoid war. Yeah, how would that work?
Because there are if countries in danger to have a war with another one, it's to prevent because they have a backup this country is backing this up with the bigger country, so just to stop the other person.
Exactly, right? So nobody's going to attack me, hopefully, because I've got two friends behind me, and if you attack me, you're going to be dealing with all of us, right? Hopefully, well, that was the idea, right? Ben, what about another one?
Also, the rearmaments.
Yeah. Yeah, the rearmament or militarism, as they called it, right? So what's everybody doing at that time?
They're all doing military forces, so they're scared of each other's military forces
Mm-hmm. Yeah, everybody is arming themselves. Everybody is building military weapons and getting ready, right? Nobody's quite sure why. Everybody's nervous, but everyone's arming themselves. And again, spoiler alert, weapons that get built often get used, right? And so everybody's ready for something to happen, and then as Ryan mentioned, something does happen. There's one more thing. David, do you have it for me? I know you've kind of, unfortunately your number has come up now, but one more underlying cause of the war? The what? No, he's later. Yeah. Yeah. He's alive at this point. He's alive, and actually he's going to fight in World War I, believe it or not. Yeah, he's just going to be a regular soldier in World War I. So he's around, but nobody really knows who he is at the moment. Maybe even he doesn't know who he is.
He does love Germany at that time.
What's that?
He does still love Germany at that time.
Still loves Germany at that time, yeah.
Although he's from Austria.
That is true. That is true. One more underlying cause. It was, if you remember, all of that kind of unrest and trouble in the Balkans, right? Yeah, so in that one area, kind of just to the northwest of Greece, under the control of Austria-Hungary, lots of trade going through that area. but the people in that area are all kind of different cultures, different ethnicities, and they want to be independent. They want their own country. They don't want to be under the control of Austria-Hungary, right? Austria-Hungary says, no, we're going to control you, settle down, you're not getting any independence. They continue to fight for it, right? We have terrorist organizations popping up. The Black Hand, of course, is just one of these. They assassinate our good friend, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and poof, right? Everyone is suddenly at war, right? And so that alliance system that Regina told us about kind of backfires a little bit, right? Because people, rather than, oh, I don't want to, nobody will attack me because I have powerful friends, it's, I can attack someone else because I have powerful friends, right? So it kind of works the opposite way as it's supposed to, right? And again, within, I think, a couple of weeks' time, everyone has declared war on everyone else, and it is on, right? And again, it's kind of tragic, it's kind of ridiculous. I don't think most people care much about Franz Ferdinand, maybe the Austro-Hungarians, but that's about it. But because of that alliance system, everybody is in, right? Now, do I want you to read that? Let me just have a look and just make sure. Yeah, I think I do want you to read that. So we'll see how this goes here. This is our first kind of entry into the textbook. I'll ask you to read pages 10 to 15 and answer the questions here. If you are online, just give me 2 seconds and I will add these into Microsoft Teams so that you can read them as well. You, my friend, I'll give a book. Can you just take a picture of the front of the book so that I will see that number and then just Teams message it to you? All right. So I'll let you read. Now, when you read, people, usually when I ask you to read a section of the textbook, what I mean is just the white section. So, if you see a little kind of gray colored section here, you can skip it. Don't worry about it. Gray section, you can skip that. Also, if there's a purple section, I'll usually tell you to skip over it unless we're specifically reading it. So just the white sections, okay? So yeah, I'll let you start reading. And online people, I'll have the pages for you in Microsoft Teams in just a moment. If you're online, it'll be in Microsoft Teams under Files, and then you'll see a folder that's called Text Resources, and that's where you'll find it. Okay, and the questions are on 27. Okay. Good. Avtej, got it. Thank you. was just thinking this while I was reading, but on page 11, in the red there, it says Balkans, the powder keg of Europe. Does anyone know what a powder keg is? Any idea? No. It's one of these things that, like, it becomes an expression, but as time goes on, like, you get so far away from what the original thing is, nobody knows what it means anymore. And so, yeah, so the powder they're talking about is like gunpowder, right? Or like explosive powder. And they used to store it in wooden barrels, right? So you'd have a little wooden barrel full of gunpowder. So it's a powder keg, right? So you can imagine if you tossed a spark near this powder keg, it would explode, right? So that's what they're talking about here. But again, none of you have probably ever seen a powder. I've never seen a powder keg before, but that's what they're talking about. It's a metaphor. maybe just another minute or so. Hopefully that's enough, and then we can talk about some of these. Okay, so let's try to answer some of these as best we can. Just as a little bit of a heads up, these are the kinds of things I would ask on a quiz, right? These are the kind of questions that I would pull right out of the textbook and drop into a quiz, right? So if we can work out the answers to these, and if you take notes or record them for yourselves, then you are ready to go for your quiz, right? You won't have to go back and reread everything, which is seems like a waste of time, but whatever you like to do. Let's look at number one. So they start right at kind of the beginning of the 1900s and maybe a little bit earlier, and they talk about the process of industrialization, right? So but countries building factories that are run by machines, right? Big steam-powered machines, and that helps to do a lot more work a lot more quickly, and of course allows these countries to produce a lot at a cheaper price and therefore make lots of money. And how does that affect the global power structure? How does that affect the global power structure? Or maybe I'll ask you this. What about the global power structure today, like right now? Who are the big players? Who are the tough guys? China, US, Russia. Anyone else? Britain? Yeah, to a lesser extent, right? So like if we wanted to create like a pyramid, we'd probably put the US and Russia and China at the top, and then maybe EU. Where? North Korea. They're not very strong. I think you could make comparisons to China or Russia in some ways, but in terms of like who's got the muscle, right? Who has the power to do things and everyone else just has to live with it, right? That's the US, China, Russia, the EU, Britain, right? They're a little bit lower down. I guess we could probably go further, but that's far enough, right? The global power structure is kind of a three-person show right now between those three big guys. But at this time, what does industrialization do to that power structure? Who does it put on the top? Germany's up there, yeah. Britain, France. Russia? Yeah, they're probably a lower power. They're probably a lower power than at the moment. Industrialization is kind of what kind of starts to create superpowers, if you will, right? Before, everyone was kind of mostly on the same level, right? But now industrialization has given some countries a lot more economic power and a lot more technological power, right? Suddenly these people can, countries like Britain and France and Germany can produce huge amounts of whatever they want, right? Maybe it's textiles, or maybe it's clothing, or maybe it's weapons, right? And so these countries get put onto the top of the global power structure because of their industrialization, right? And other countries later on will try to industrialize as well so that they can get on the top, right? Or they can get closer to the top. I'll answer this second question because it's kind of not fair, because the answer is in a section that I told you not to read, which is not cool of me. It's okay. It says here, the Balkan Wars, how did they contribute to the outbreak of the First World War? Well, during the first round of Balkan Wars in 1912 and 1913, those Balkan countries were fighting for independence. And long story short, they didn't really get it, right? They fought for a while. They had a truce. They had some peace talks. They couldn't agree. People started fighting again. And then the peace talks were over and everything went back to the way it was. So there was maybe an opportunity for those issues to get solved, but they weren't solved. They fought for a while, then they talked, then they fought again, and the same problems continued, right? And of course, we know that push for independence by Serbia is what led Gavrilo Princip to kill Franz Ferdinand and sort of kick off the First World War, right? So if those issues got resolved during the first Balkan Wars, I don't know, maybe things might have turned out differently, but of course they didn't. They talk a little bit here about, this is after war gets declared and everybody's fighting. What is this Schlieffen Plan?
Push out the France before the Russians. Push out the France first to focus on the Russian wars.
Right. So once the war gets kicked off here, as you can see, if you're Germany and Austria-Hungary, so if you're the Central Powers, you have a bit of a problem, right? You are sandwiched between two enemies, which is not a place you want to be. So again, if you ever wind up commanding armed forces in the future, Regina, I'm looking at you. If you ever wind up commanding armed forces in the future, you don't want a two-front war, right? You don't want to have enemies on both sides, because then you have to take your army and you have to split them in two, right? And then you're fighting at half strength in two places. And that's a tough strategy, right? It's tough to win that way. And so, yeah, the Germans developed this Schlieffen Plan, and their idea is to declare war, rush in, and knock France out of the fight really quickly. Almost sucker punch them, if you will. Knock them out of the fight, and then they can turn around and deal with Russia on the other side, right? They're betting that the French won't be ready. They're betting that the Russians will take a long time to advance from Moscow and kind of get close to Germany and Austria-Hungary. And so their plan is to knock them out and then deal with the Russians later. Right? Does that work? Does their plan work? They wish it worked. Whoops. They wish it worked, but it really didn't, right? So they tried to go right for Paris, right? They went through Belgium, tried to go for Paris. The French pushed them away. The British came to help out, and basically they get involved. Where's my map again here? There we go. Sorry, online people. They get involved in this kind of race to the sea, right? So the French are kind of coming from here, the Germans are coming from here, and both sides are trying to get around behind the other one. right? If you can kind of circle in, then you can crush them. So both sides are trying to get behind the other one. So they keep going like this, like this, like this, and they finally get to the water. They get to the English Channel. They called it the race to the sea. Not much of a race, but... And so they're trying to get behind each other. They can't. And then finally they're stuck, right? And again, that sort of line that gets drawn between the Allied powers and the Central powers, it basically stays there for the rest of the war. And so they'll fight back and forth. They'll kind of move a couple of kilometers one way or the other, but nothing much really happened, except millions of people will die there. So the Schlieffen Plan doesn't work. The Western Front, as they call it, kind of gets established. And now Germany and Austria-Hungary are fighting a two-front war. I'm going to leave number 4. Why did the assassination of Franz Ferdinand precipitate the war? I think we kind of understood that, right? Is that, well, no, you know what? Why don't you tell me? How does the assassination of this guy start the war? Oh no, Franz Ferdinand, you're dead. We will avenge you. No, it's not like that, right? What happens? It's kind of complicated, but maybe just give me the general.
I think it's kind of like they thought that they sent somebody from Serbia to like actually find out assassination of France because they had like tensions between Serbia and Austria-Hungary.
Yep.
And then since Austria-Hungary had always been like having a bad thought about Serbia, they just took it as like an excuse to invade Serbia.
Yeah, right. So Austria-Hungary kind of doesn't really like Serbia. They've had enough. They say, that's it. We demand an investigation. We're coming in, right? And Serbia says, no, you're not. And if you do, my big friend Russia will help me out, right? And Austria-Hungary says, of course, well, we're coming in because we have a big friend too, Germany, right? And then France gets involved, and then everyone is kind of pulled in, right? And so again, it's not really about Franz Ferdinand. It's really that alliance system, right, that will suck everybody into the war. In number 5, they talk about the formation of Germany. So prior to 1870, Germany is not one country. It's actually a bunch of little areas run by burghers and Meisterburgers, I think. So each kind of territory has its own little governor, but it's not united into one country. And in 1870, Germany is united. And so what is that? How does that change the kind of balance of power in Europe, the unification of Germany? Last one, and then I'll give you a break. Promise.
Kind of make them like another industrialized giant. So they kind of, before they weren't really a major power.
Yeah.
And after they were like becoming kind of major power. And they just kind of created another huge economic power that would go around Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's another big, powerful country in Europe all of a sudden, right? And so before, you'd have all these little territories that were all ruled by someone else, where Germany was, and they're not really a threat. They're not unified. Sometimes they're fighting with each other. You know, you can bribe one of them easily enough, and they're just not a factor, right? And so Britain and France are kind of the big powers in Europe at the time. And then suddenly Germany is unified, right? And you have this country of 60 million people kind of going in the same direction and cooperating, right? So all of a sudden there's a new superpower, right? It's almost, you could probably almost think of it as if Europe actually unified, right? So they have the European Union, they cooperate, but they're still very much, 18 or 19 different countries. But imagine if they suddenly unified into one group, right? That would be different, right? That would change the power structure globally if Europe was one country, right? And that's kind of exactly what happens with Germany here. Suddenly we have this big group of people that are now cooperating and working together, and Britain and France got to figure out how to deal with this new powerful country. Okay, let's take a little break. When we come back, I have a couple of videos to show you, and then we will talk about what's going on at home, not just the fighting part, but also what's happening for people who stay home. Okay, so let's take a break, and then we'll deal with that when we come back. All right, and oops, don't need that counter. And we are back. So before we jump back in, I just wanted to show you one thing, and it's just kind of for fun. Online people, I can't stream other videos through my live stream because then it'll be a copyright thing and they'll take my video down. So I just put a link to a YouTube video in the live chat for you to watch. I'm just going to show it in here. It's 2 minutes long. It's kind of goofy and stupid, but maybe you'll find it funny. It's a little piece from a comedy show, and what you're seeing is they're pretending to be World War I soldiers. Okay, so they're pretending to be World War I soldiers who are talking about why the war started in the first place, which of course we just finished talking about. So online people, I'll see you in just a minute. You can watch the video. The link is in the live chat. Yeah, we'll see you in just 2 minutes.
Bugger all to do except sit and wait. Bugger all to do except sit and wait.
Well, I don't know, sir. We could have a jolly game of charades.
Oh, yes.
And sing-along of musical hits like Birmingham Bertie and Whoops, Mrs. McGinns, you're setting on my artichokes.
Yes, I think bugger all might be rather more fun.
Permission to ask a question, sir?
Permission granted, Baldrick, as long as it isn't the one about where babies come from.
No. The thing is, the way I see it, these days there's a war on, right? And ages ago there wasn't a war on, right? So there must have been a moment when there not being a war on went away, right? And there being a war on came along. So, what I want to know is, how did we get from the one case of affairs to the other case of affairs?
Do you mean, how did the war start?
Yeah.
The war started because of the vile Hun and his villainous empire building.
George, the British Empire at present covers a quarter of the globe, while the German Empire consists of a small sausage factory in Tanganyika. I hardly think that we can be entirely absolved from blame on the imperialistic front.
Oh, no, sir, absolutely not. Man, it's a bicycle.
I heard that it started when a bloke called Archie Duke shot an ostrich because he was hungry.
I think you mean it started when the Archduke of Austro-Hungary got shot.
No, there was definitely an ostrich involved.
Well, possibly. But the real reason for the whole thing was that it was just too much effort not to have a war.
By gum, this is interesting. I always loved history. The Battle of Hastings, Henry VIII and his 6 knives, all that.
You see, Baldrick, in order to prevent war in Europe, 2 superblocks developed. Us, the French and the Russians on one side, and the Germans and Austro-Hungary on the other. The idea was to have 2 vast opposing armies, each acting as the other's deterrent. That way, there could never be a war.
But this is a sort of a war, isn't it, sir?
Yes, that's right. You see, there was a tiny flaw in the plan.
What was that, sir?
It was bollocks.
So the poor old ostrich died for nothing.
Right.
So, we're agreed. France gets the city of Pinerolo and the bishopric of Metz, and to Sweden goes Western Pomerania.
Again, I don't know if you kind of got that or if it was funny or if it wasn't funny. But yeah, so why did the war start? And the one guy says, well, it's because a guy named Archie Duke shot an ostrich because he was hungry. He's like, no. No, Archduke of Austria-Hungary got shot, right? And he says there was this alliance system meant to deter anyone from attacking, but it was bollocks, right? It was nonsense. It was ridiculous, right? It was, so I don't know. Maybe it was funny, maybe it wasn't. But the poor ostrich died for nothing. Anyway. The last question I asked you was briefly describe the first few months of the war and explain the results. So what's kind of going on in the first few months of the war? What do we hear about? What do we hear about?
Germany was trying to cross through Belgium and trying to encircle the troops that French had
Right?
around Arras and Rouen.
Right?
But that's didn't go really well for Germany as it's just continued trench wars with each other, just pushing backwards and continuously with no positive gain on either side.
No end in sight.
And then just continue to a stalemate.
Yeah. Very true. So Ben tells us that, of course, France and Germany kind of get into it. The Germans go through Belgium. Poor Belgium. They always try to stay neutral. They're always like, no, leave us out of it. We don't want to be part of it. And then the next thing you know, armies are going through Belgium, and every time, So the Germans and the French kind of get into some battles. They try to sort of conquer each other. They're not really able to do it, and they set up some trenches, and they're in a stalemate, right? What's a stalemate? What does that mean? It's a stalemate.
Nothing happened really.
Yeah, nothing happening, right? It's kind of a situation where two groups are in competition, but you just can't win, right? There's just nothing you can do. You're stuck. You're stuck where you are, right? And so that's where things are on the Western Front. It's a stalemate. They're kind of stuck where they are. Nobody can really win. Nobody seems to be able to get too much progress in defeating the other side. They're just kind of stuck. They're fighting, but they're stuck. Nothing's really happening. Let me just see what. Oh yeah, okay. How did people feel about the war early on? So war is declared, and do people go, "Oh no, how terrible"? What's the kind of feeling? Where is it? Let's look. Look on page. Oh yeah, on page 13. The outbreak of hostilities in 1914 was greeted on all sides with wild enthusiasm. It's kind of a strange, is that a strange reaction to? No, not really?
Because most of the nations were kind of nationalists.
Yeah.
And they were proud that the country is going to gain more land.
Right. There's a little bit of nationalism or patriotism, right? Although I think if Justin Trudeau told us tomorrow that Canada had declared war on China, I don't think Canadians would be like, woo! But it was, it was a different time. It was 100 years ago. It's true. People are excited, right? There's a lot of enthusiasm and cheering and nationalism and flag waving and things like that, right? People are really excited, and in a way, it does kind of seem weird because, again, I think if Canada was going to war with China tomorrow, I don't think I would be that excited about it, right? But one of the reasons why people are so excited is because of this. And so I don't know if you've ever seen pictures like this before, or maybe movies that are kind of like this, but this is kind of this is warfare in the 18th century and the 17th century too, right? So I'm not sure where this is from. This is probably from early American history, although it could be European as well. And this is kind of how people fought wars once upon a time, right? They would line up, there'd be two lines across from one another, they'd march, and then everybody would pull out their guns and they'd shoot at the other guy, and then they'd have to reload their guns, but the guns are pretty primitive, so they take about 2 minutes to reload. Meanwhile, people are shooting at you. Of course, the guns aren't very accurate. They're firing these little lead balls, which don't really go straight, and so who knows if you're hitting anything. It's kind of a crazy thing to do. And then maybe when they get close, they try to stick each other with the little bayonet, right? The knife tip on the end of their rifle. It's a pretty basic way of warfare. You know, people died and things like that. But it's kind of a different way of warfare. And it was very kind of romantic, right? There was people on horseback, right? Look at that guy on horseback with his hat. Come on, troops, let's go give it to the British kind of thing or whatever, right? So it was a very kind of heroic, romantic, exciting way of warfare. And sure, people died, right? But this is kind of, that's what makes it heroic, right? This is kind of the type of warfare that people were used to. And so when World War I was on, right, when everybody went to war, this is what all these young men were picturing in their heads, right? They'd all read stories about Napoleon's army and this kind of style of warfare, and they're like, we're going to do this too, right? We're going to go off, we're going to put on our uniforms, we're going to look very handsome, the girls will be all over us, we're going to go there, we're going to fight for a few months, it'll be a grand adventure, we'll come back heroes, then the girls will really be all over us, and it'll be just great. Right? That's kind of what these guys are thinking. And because of that, and not to mention the nationalism and patriotism, and so young men sign up in huge numbers. Canada, I think Canada, when we kind of got into the war, I think we promised like 20,000 troops. We promised them 20,000 soldiers, the British. And our prime minister at the time, he didn't really know how he was going to get those 20,000, but he promised them anyway. But as it turned out, something like 25,000 young men just signed up anyway. He didn't even have to try to sell them on it or advertise. They just came out of nowhere and signed up, ready to go, right? And again, lots and lots of young men did this. It was very exciting. It was very romantic. It was a chance to gain glory. For some of them, it was a paycheck because you got paid in the army. For some of them, it meant that, they would be much more attractive to the girls, which is not to be underestimated, right? And so, yeah, it was kind of a grand adventure, right? But unfortunately, everybody, including these young men, had really no idea what they were getting into. Because this is the first war, this is the first industrial war, right? This is the first war in which technology is going to play a major, major factor, right? Because of the Industrial Revolution, people are capable of creating machines and tools that can kill people in huge numbers, right? And with an efficiency that no one has ever seen before, right? And so it becomes, not a war that looks like this, but a war that looks much different, right? Unfortunately, when the war kicks off, lots of generals are still going to battle like this. Believe it or not, if you look at pictures from early World War I, they're riding horses. They've all got swords for some reason, right? But again, the problem is the Scottish, the regiments from Scotland were wearing kilts, for crying out loud, right? And so they're marching into battle with their kilts and their swords. But meanwhile, there's all kinds of different technology on the field, right? There's mortars, right? There's launched explosives. There's machine guns for the first time ever, right? So instead of bang, 2 minutes to reload, it's brrrr, you know, your horse and your sword just aren't going to do it in a war like that. But nobody's really prepared for it, right? And it becomes, again, not a grand romantic adventure, but it becomes hellish, basically. Just to kind of show you this, I have 2 short videos to show you, just to kind of give you some images and ideas of what we're talking about here. For online people, you'll find this video in Microsoft Teams. If you go into Files, you'll see that there's a folder there that says Videos. And in the videos, there's a file that will play. So we're just going to watch these 2 very short videos. They're probably 2 or 3 minutes each. Then we'll come back and just sort of review what we've seen, okay? So online people, I'll turn you loose to look at those. Again, Microsoft Teams, Files, and then there's a folder that says Videos, okay? So we'll see you in just a few minutes after we watch that.
Life in a trench, I'd like to explain in one word: horrific. It's mud, it's death, it's rats, it's stench, and soldiers develop an attitude in a trench that everybody is going to die.
Life in the trench was abysmal. There were several lines of trenches, and the front line trenches, of course, were the most dangerous because they were constantly under fire.
Incoming! The Germans dug assiduously, building dry, safe, and comfortable trenches for themselves with bunkers that actually had electricity and sometimes running water. The British and French, who were convinced that they were never going to be there for that long, didn't spend nearly the same effort. And so their trenches tended to be muddy and wet and not that safe.
Disease ran rampant. It was very difficult to get any sort of sleep, a decent hot meal, keep your clothes dry, and more importantly, to keep your sanity.
There were so many health problems of just simple disease that took much more men out of combat than direct fire.
I think one word that would surprise people about life in a trench: boredom. A lot of time is spent just sitting, cleaning tools, and being scared to death the battle's going to start any minute.
It was just the day-to-day monotony of being trapped in this very small space and fighting for a war that's really fought in inches.
The idea of open warfare, of fighting out into what they called no man's land, wasn't working. The technology of the war had advanced so much with machine guns, artillery that could lob shells a mile. It became mostly a defensive war early on, and as a defensive war, you wanted to protect your troops, so the miles and miles of trenches were built.
There were often bodies buried in the sides of trenches, bodies lying out in the open in front of the trenches. The soldiers were experiencing not only the war that they were fighting at the moment, but the war that had been going on throughout those trenches for all of the years of the war.
A young lieutenant writes his mother and says, "I haven't been killed yet, but it's only a matter of time." That's typical of the way soldiers felt about life in the trench. You just did it. You existed day to day, tried to go on, keep your chin up, But one day, the bullet was going to have your name on it, and you were going to perish. You weren't going home.
I think one really clear way of understanding the shift in World War I in terms of technology is that soldiers rode in on horses and they left in airplanes.
At the beginning of World War I, warfare is almost in the 19th century style. The French sincerely believed that going at the troops with determination at enemy troops is the way to go. What they don't understand is the collision of technologies.
General Pershing didn't believe in the trench warfare. He grew up on the plains fighting in Indian warfare where it was an open confrontation. So he trained his troops to fight in the open warfare. The British and French generals thought he was crazy. They criticized him for this.
It's impossible to cross that deadly beaten zone, the deadly zone between the two lines. The most determined line of soldiers cannot oppose a machine gun that fires hundreds of rounds a minute.
World War I wasn't just the first industrial war, it was also the first scientific war. It was the first time that societies had taken all of their resources of science and intelligence and said, how do we do this better? How do we fight better? How do we develop technologies?
A lot of the armaments you see in World War I had been used before: submarines, trench warfare, Gatling guns, machine guns. What happens during World War I is that these become mature and these become even more destructive.
During the war, the governments of all the different warring powers put enormous amounts of time and effort into scientific and technical development, so that the advancements which would have happened anyway happen at a much more rapid pace, and they happen according to the priorities of the warring powers.
Something happened in trench warfare that changed the course of the war and changed the way we understand warfare today, and that is chemical warfare.
The first gas attack was at a place called Vimy Ridge, and it was mostly Canadian soldiers who were being attacked. And the Canadian soldiers who were in the trenches saw this cloud of haze coming towards them. They had no gas masks. They had no equipment to protect them. Chlorine gas causes your lungs to fill with liquid, and so essentially you drown from the inside out. It was really the first war in which all of the technologies and science and industry of the 19th century were put to the sole purpose of killing people.
Yeah, so as you can see, just not really the war that people were expecting, right? Again, they had grown up with stories of, you know, these kind of war on horseback or marching into battle. Again, some of these generals had fought in such wars, but again, it's not where we are, right, in terms of technology. There's all of these brand new things. There's machine guns, which make it impossible to just march at your enemy, right, unless you have a death wish. And so people start building trenches like you saw in the video, right? And life in there is pretty miserable, right? It's cold, it's wet, your feet are in water all the time. In fact, some people get what they call trench foot, which is kind of like a bacterial infection in your feet because your feet are just always in the water for days at a time. They're wet for days at a time. Sure. And yeah, you're just kind of sitting there hoping a bomb doesn't drop on your head, right? Or hoping you don't get gassed out of nowhere, right? And so people are just kind of sitting there waiting to die, right? Yeah, so we see some new technologies. We see machine guns. We see poison gas used in a couple of places. They pretty quickly, the two sides very quickly decide to put an end to it. But in the early parts of the war, it's something that these soldiers have to deal with. And of course, they've never seen it before, don't know what it is. Gas masks, you can see all these guys wearing gas masks there, but it does take the military a while to develop them, manufacture them, and get them into the hands of soldiers, right? Airplanes. Airplanes are part of the technology of World War I, but they are brand new, right? The first airplane ever to actually maintain flight was from 1911. That was 3 years before this. So this is brand new technology. These planes are not super dependable, right? They are rickety, frightening machines that hopefully will stay in the air. And I think from what I hear, the pilots of these planes actually weren't given parachutes because the military was worried that if they had a parachute and they got into trouble, they would just jump out of the plane and then they'd lose the plane. So they didn't give them parachutes, hoping that they would actually try to land the plane and not, so it wouldn't be destroyed. Insanity, right? Early on, the planes are just used for reconnaissance to kind of see what the enemy's doing. Pretty quickly, they start attaching machine guns to them, and before you know it, these planes are trying to shoot each other down, Top Gun style, but in slow motion. Let's see here. Oh yeah, massive artillery guns, right? Things that can lob explosive, hundreds and hundreds of meters, right? Guns so big they have to be moved on a rail, right? Brand new, and certainly not anything that anyone's ever dealt with before. A little later on, we see the development of tanks, right? So tanks are created because, again, you've got those two trenches dug in. You've got guys firing at each other over the trench, but nobody can really take any ground, right? Because as soon as you come out of the trench, you're going to get shot down, right? So they start developing some sort of vehicle that's bulletproof and can drive across there. And tanks are those things, but they take a few years to develop. And the early ones are kind of not super reliable. Yeah, so here you see some gas masks, some machine guns. We know we have chemical weapons for the first time ever, right? That's scary and dangerous. And so, yeah, here we have a whole new kind of war, right? People are very excited to go to war at first, but again, they don't really have a sense of what they're getting into. And very quickly, it turns out to be a pretty hellish experience, right? And at the beginning parts of the war, I know we haven't read that far yet. Sorry, I'm just looking for a number here. Yeah, during the first 5 months of battle, 600,000 soldiers were killed, right? And so this is a massive amount of people dying in a very short period, right? And like one of those historians mentions, it's a clash between 19th century tactics and 20th century technology, right? And again, in the beginning parts of the war, young men are just cut down hundreds and hundreds and hundreds by the day because just nobody's really sure how to fight this style of war. Okay. So that's all I have for you today. Come back tomorrow and we'll deal with what's happening on the home front because, sorry if this is a disappointment to you, but I'm not a huge fan of like the history of like battles and things like that. I'm kind of more interested in other things, which we'll do a bit of both. But it's really interesting what's happening at home. And so we'll read a little section of the textbook that talks about what's happening in Britain for the people who stayed home, because the people at war are having one experience, right, which is kind of hellish. But the people at home, a lot of things are going to change for them too. And it'll be interesting to kind of think about what kind of changes are happening in the war, but what kind of changes are happening at home as well, okay? But I'll leave that until tomorrow. I'll let you pack it up and go have some lunch, unless you had it already. And I'll see you tomorrow. Coolio? Cool? Okay. All right, that is it, my friends. Have a nice afternoon. See you tomorrow.